It was a bright, warm afternoon when Karen decided to take a much-needed break. The sun shone down, casting a golden hue across her backyard. She stood by her sliding glass door, glancing out at the pool that had been her retreat for so many years. For Karen, her backyard was more than just a space. It was a sanctuary where she could disconnect from the chaos of the world. She had been working tirelessly as a sheriff for the past several years, often dealing with high-stress situations. From the moment she stepped out into the backyard, she knew this would be the perfect place to unwind. The water in the pool shimmered, inviting her in. She had been working long hours, dealing with everything from routine calls to more intense moments in the community. And now, as she slipped into the cool, refreshing water, she felt her muscles begin to relax. The weight of her responsibilities seemed to fade, even if just for a while. Her mind, usually racing with the latest case or the latest patrol, was quiet now. All she could hear was the soft sound of the breeze moving through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird nearby. Karen made herself comfortable on the lounge chair beside the pool, a towel draped over her chest as she tilted her head back to soak in the warmth of the sun. Her pool was surrounded by tall hedges, offering privacy from the neighborhood. The area was her space, her escape from the sometimes overwhelming demands of her job. She could finally breathe, knowing that for a few hours, she wouldn't have to worry about answering a call or dealing with the complex world of law enforcement. Her mind wandered to the moments before she settled down for this rare moment of peace. She had spent the last few days handling a particularly tense situation in the department, one that had taken up most of her focus. When you're in law enforcement, the world often feels like it's moving at breakneck speed. There's little time to stop and reflect. Karen often found herself running from one task to another, only finding time to pause when she was off duty. That was when she could finally catch her breath, even if just for a little while. As she closed her eyes, the warmth of the sun on her skin was almost comforting. She let out a sigh, feeling the soft breeze brush across her face. There was a sense of peace here that she couldn't find anywhere else. Her work, though fulfilling, was often stressful. Being a sheriff came with its own set of challenges, not only because of the responsibility it entailed, but also because of the bias and prejudice that many still held toward people like her. Karen was no stranger to the extra hurdles she sometimes faced. She had worked hard to get to where she was, proving herself every step of the way. But here, by the pool, none of that mattered. She could just be herself, free from the pressures of her job and the judgment of others. The afternoon passed slowly, and Karen was content. She stretched her legs out, looking up at the sky and watching the clouds lazily drift by. Time seemed to stand still. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the pool, and Karen realized how rare it was for her to have a moment like this. In the rush of daily life, these pockets of calm often went unnoticed, and she was determined not to take this one for granted. Just as Karen was about to lean back in her chair, the sound of footsteps caught her attention. She glanced toward the fence that bordered her property, but the sight of her neighbor's house caught her eye. Karen had lived in this neighborhood for years. Most of the neighbors were friendly, although some kept to themselves. She had never really interacted much with the woman next door, but she knew who she was. The woman, an older white woman, had lived there long before Karen moved in, and though they'd exchanged the occasional wave, there wasn't much of a relationship between them. Karen's attention shifted back to the pool. She wasn't one to worry about what her neighbors thought, but the moment lingered in her mind. She had always valued her privacy, and the last thing she wanted was to feel scrutinized or judged. The woman next door had always seemed polite, but Karen couldn't help but feel that there was a certain distance between them. In the past, she had wondered if it was because of her position as sheriff or her being a black woman in a predominantly white neighborhood. But it wasn't something she dwelled on. After all, Karen had learned to be resilient in the face of prejudice and had always carried herself with professionalism and pride. What Karen didn't know, however, was that the older woman had been watching her from behind her window. From her vantage point, she could clearly see Karen relaxing by the pool, the sun shining down on her. The woman squinted as she peered through the blinds, an odd sense of discomfort creeping over her. For reasons that would later be hard for her to explain, she felt uneasy seeing Karen lounging by the pool, enjoying her day. She couldn't pinpoint what it was. Perhaps it was the fact that Karen was alone, or that she didn't quite fit the image of the typical neighbor she was used to seeing. But the feeling was strong and it made her uneasy. Unable to shake the nagging discomfort, the woman stepped away from the window and grabbed her phone. Her fingers hesitated for a moment before she dialed the number she knew all too well. The local police department. As she waited for someone to pick up, she told herself that something didn't seem right. She didn't know what it was, but she couldn't ignore the feeling of unease. Maybe it was the way Karen looked so relaxed in her backyard, or maybe it was something else entirely. She wasn't sure. But what she was certain of was that she didn't feel comfortable with the situation, and so she made the call. She explained to the dispatcher that there was someone in the backyard, someone she didn't recognize, and it didn't seem right. Her voice was hesitant but firm as she made her request. There was a pause on the other end, and then the dispatcher assured her that an officer would be sent over to check things out. It didn't occur to her at the time that she was making a judgment call based on nothing more than a feeling. She didn't know Karen personally, and yet she had assumed that something was off. Back in the backyard, Karen continued to relax by the pool, unaware that her peaceful afternoon was about to take a sharp turn. She had no idea that across the yard, behind the safety of her tall hedges, her neighbor had made a call to the police. She didn't expect her quiet day to be interrupted, but as the minutes passed, something began to change. Minutes passed, and Karen continued to relax, unaware of the events that were slowly unfolding in her neighborhood. The breeze whispered through the trees, the sound of water gently splashing against the sides of the pool. She had been working hard for weeks, and this was her time to recharge. It was rare for her to have a moment like this. As she stretched out on her lounge chair, she let herself feel the weight of the world lift, if only for a while. But outside her bubble of calm, things were beginning to shift. The phone call from her neighbor had been made, and the wheels of an uncomfortable situation were already in motion. The dispatcher had assured the woman that an officer would be sent to check on the backyard. Karen had no idea that her peaceful afternoon was being observed from behind drawn curtains. Meanwhile, 2 police officers were on their way to the scene. It was an unusual call, one that raised more questions than answers. They had received the information from the dispatcher, but it didn't seem to be an urgent matter. A suspicious person in a backyard? It didn't add up. Yet their job was to respond, no matter how minor the issue seemed. As the officers approached the neighborhood, the atmosphere was quiet. The streets were lined with neatly manicured lawns, and the houses looked like they belonged in a magazine, calm and picture-perfect. There was no indication that anything was out of place, no signs of distress, just the usual peaceful suburban setting. Yet the officers felt a sense of unease as they neared the house where Karen was relaxing. It wasn't the first time they'd been called to check on a situation that later seemed unnecessary, but it was their duty to investigate. The officer driving the patrol car pulled into the quiet street and slowly made his way toward the house. His partner, the rookie officer, looked out the window, unsure of what to expect. They had been trained for all kinds of situations, from routine traffic stops to more dangerous confrontations. But this felt different. They had no idea what they were walking into, and neither of them could have predicted what was about to happen. The patrol car came to a stop in front of the house, and the officers got out, walking toward the front door. As they approached, Karen was still lounging by the pool, enjoying her rare moment of peace. The sound of the officers' footsteps on the gravel path barely reached her ears. She hadn't noticed them at all. It wasn't until they were standing on the other side of the fence near the edge of the yard that she finally saw them. The officers were standing just beyond the pool, looking at her. There was no urgency in their movements, no sign of distress, just 2 uniformed figures in the distance. Karen raised an eyebrow, confused but calm. She had no reason to be alarmed. After all, she was in her own backyard, enjoying a quiet day off. She sat up, adjusting her towel and glancing at the officers. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady. The officers exchanged glances before one of them spoke up. "We received a call about a person being in the backyard. Is everything okay?" Karen's eyes narrowed for a moment. "Everything is fine," she replied. "I live here. I'm just relaxing in my own pool." The officers seemed to hesitate. They weren't sure what to make of the situation. They had responded to a call from a neighbor who had reported seeing someone suspicious in the yard. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and they certainly hadn't expected this encounter. They assumed they were dealing with someone who might be trespassing or engaging in unusual behavior, but they hadn't expected Karen to be so composed, so calm. "We just need to check things out," one of the officers said, his tone more cautious now. He took a step forward and the other officer followed. "We just want to make sure everything's okay." Karen, still not fully understanding the situation, remained calm. She didn't raise her voice and she didn't seem irritated. She simply looked at the officers, her expression unreadable. For a moment the atmosphere felt tense, as if the situation was about to escalate, but Karen had been in law enforcement long enough to know how to handle tense situations. She didn't panic. She didn't let the officer's presence rattle her. "I'm the sheriff," she said slowly, watching their reactions closely. "I don't need to explain myself to you, but if you'd like to check my credentials, I'll be happy to show you." The rookie officer froze for a moment, blinking in disbelief. He had been sent out on countless calls, some of which were more dangerous or complicated than this. But never had he encountered a situation like this. He quickly fumbled for his radio, unsure of how to process the unexpected turn of events. The other officer, older and more experienced, seemed to recognize the shift in the situation. His eyes widened slightly as he processed Karen's words. "You're the sheriff?" the older officer asked, his voice more surprised than anything else. Karen nodded, standing up slowly. She wasn't defensive, but there was a quiet authority in her stance. "Yes," she said simply. "Now if you'd like to check, I can show you my badge." The rookie officer hesitated, still processing the information. It wasn't often they had to deal with someone who outranked them so directly. It wasn't the kind of thing that came up on a typical call. Meanwhile, Karen remained patient, her eyes steady and calm, but a flicker of frustration crossed her mind. This situation, as simple as it seemed, was already more complicated than it needed to be. The rookie officer stepped back, pulling out his radio again. I need to check something," he mumbled into the device. It didn't take long for the officer to confirm Karen's identity. The moment the information came through, both officers stood still, almost frozen. They had just come face to face with the sheriff, the very person they worked under. The realization dawned on them both at the same time. The situation wasn't what they thought it was. The tension that had been hanging in the air evaporated, but the awkwardness remained. The older officer cleared his throat, his face flushing slightly as he looked back at Karen. "We're sorry for the confusion," he said, sounding more embarrassed than apologetic. "We had no idea who you were. It was just a call and we had to check it out." Karen's expression softened, but she didn't let the situation slide. "I understand," she said. "But it's also a reminder that sometimes assumptions get in the way. I'm just here enjoying my day off. I shouldn't have to explain myself to anyone." The rookie officer, still in a state of shock, nodded quickly. "We apologize, ma'am. It won't happen again." Karen nodded, but the sting of the encounter lingered. She wasn't angry, at least not outwardly, but she couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. She had been judged, not for anything she had done, but for who she was. The color of her skin, her presence in her own backyard. It was enough to make someone suspicious. She had been forced to prove herself in an encounter that should never have happened. As the officers turned to leave, Karen stood by the pool for a moment longer, taking in the quiet around her. She knew the encounter wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a bigger picture, one that many Black people faced every day. The assumptions, the biases, the way people were treated based on appearance, it was something that weighed heavily on her mind. But for now, all she could do was take a deep breath, shake her head, and return to the quiet of her backyard. The events of the afternoon hung in the air like a heavy fog, thick with unspoken words and awkward silences. As the patrol car pulled away from her home, Karen stood by the pool, her mind racing, not just with thoughts of the incident, but also with the realization that the situation wasn't just an isolated moment. It was part of a much larger issue that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. For a while, she stood still, the cool water of the pool reflecting the sky as the sun slowly began to dip below the horizon. Karen wasn't angry, not in the way one might expect. She wasn't shouting or making a scene. Instead, there was a quiet frustration bubbling inside her. This wasn't the first time she had encountered a situation like this. In her years of service as a sheriff, she had dealt with plenty of people who underestimated her, made assumptions based on how she looked, or treated her as if she were somehow less deserving of respect than others in her profession. But this time, It stung a little more. Maybe it was because, after all, she had been in her own backyard doing nothing wrong, just trying to enjoy a moment of peace. Maybe it was the fact that she had worked so hard to prove herself in her career, to rise above the prejudices that had followed her since she first put on the uniform. Or maybe it was the realization that, despite everything, people still saw her through a lens of bias, not as the accomplished sheriff she was, but as something else entirely, a black woman who didn't belong in their world. She shook her head, pushing those thoughts away for the moment. It wasn't helpful to dwell on it. She had a job to do, and for the most part she was proud of it. But that afternoon, as the sound of the patrol car faded into the distance, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. Even in the privacy of her own backyard, Karen decided to go inside. The stillness of the afternoon was broken, and she wasn't sure she could find that same peace again. But she wasn't ready to let the situation ruin her day. She had worked too hard for too long to let something like this stop her from enjoying her life. As she walked through the sliding glass door, she glanced at the clock on the wall. It was getting late, and she had to get ready for the next day's shift. The house was quiet as Karen moved through it, lost in thought. She needed to prepare herself for the reality of what she did, being a sheriff in a world where not everyone saw her as equal, where many still viewed her with suspicion because of her skin color. She had been trained to keep her emotions in check, to stay composed even in the most difficult situations. But the encounter with the officers had shaken her in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what it represented. It was a reminder that despite all her efforts, she would always have to work harder to prove herself. As Karen went about getting ready, her thoughts drifted back to her conversation with the officers. The older one had been apologetic, but the rookie had barely spoken. She could sense the discomfort in both of them. They had been caught off guard, unsure of how to handle the situation when they realized who she was. And who could blame them? They had responded to a call, only to find out that the person they had been sent to question was someone who outranked them, someone who had worked hard to earn her position in the department. But the rookie officer's reaction stuck with her. He hadn't even known what to say when he realized she was the sheriff. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the moment. It was the reminder of how often people, even in positions of authority, were conditioned to view her through a certain lens. It was as if, despite her position, despite her years of service, she was still viewed as someone who didn't quite belong. It was a bitter truth that Karen had come to terms with over the years, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. As she stepped into her kitchen, the smell of coffee filled the air. She had always enjoyed a hot cup of coffee to start her day, even if it was late in the evening. It was her way of calming her nerves, of centering herself before the demands of her job took over. She poured herself a cup, the rich aroma filling the room, and sat down at the kitchen table. The quiet of the house was a welcome change from the tension of the afternoon. It gave her the space she needed to think, to reflect on everything that had just happened. She thought about the way the officers had approached her. They hadn't been aggressive, but they hadn't exactly been welcoming either. There was a stiffness to their behavior, an underlying tension that spoke volumes. It was clear that they had been caught off guard, but Karen couldn't help but wonder if their discomfort had been more than just a reaction to the surprise of meeting the sheriff. Was it the fact that she was a black woman in a position of authority? Was that what had made them uneasy? Karen wasn't sure, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to the situation than met the eye. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, recognizing the name on the screen. It was a colleague from the department, one of the senior officers she worked with regularly. "Hey, Karen," the voice on the other end said. "I heard about what happened earlier today. How are you holding up?" Karen took a sip of her coffee before answering. "I'm fine." It wasn't anything serious. Just one of those moments, you know? Her colleague was silent for a moment, as if weighing her words. "I get it. I'm sorry you had to go through that. You know, it's hard for some people to see past their biases, even the ones who are supposed to protect and serve. But you handled it well. You always do." Karen appreciated the reassurance, but she could still feel the sting of the incident. "Thanks, it's just, sometimes it feels like no matter how much I do, I'm still seen through a different lens. I'm always trying to prove myself." "I get it," her colleague said. but you're doing great. Keep your head up." They talked for a few more minutes, discussing work and catching up on what was happening in the department. But as the conversation ended, Karen felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't just the conversation itself, but the realization that she wasn't alone. There were others who understood the challenges she faced, who saw her for who she truly was, not just the sheriff, but a person navigating a world that often judged her by the color of her skin. As she set her phone down and finished her coffee, Karen knew that she couldn't let moments like this define her. There would always be people who questioned her, who doubted her, but she had learned over the years that her worth wasn't determined by others' perceptions. It was determined by what she did, by the work she put in, and by the integrity she brought to everything she did. The afternoon had shaken her, but it wouldn't break her. She had a job to do, and she would keep doing it with the same passion and dedication she always had. She stood up from the table, feeling the familiar surge of determination that always followed these moments of doubt. Tomorrow was another day, and she would face it head on. As she prepared for bed, Karen reflected on the lesson of the day. It wasn't about the incident with the officers, or even about the neighbor who had made the call. It was about the bigger picture, the ongoing fight against prejudice, the constant need to prove herself, and the quiet strength required to keep going despite the obstacles in her path. Tomorrow she would put on her uniform and step into her role with pride, knowing that no matter what others thought of her, she was exactly where she was meant to be. The next morning, Karen woke up to the sound of her alarm ringing, signaling the start of another busy day. The events of the previous afternoon still lingered in her mind, but she had learned to compartmentalize those feelings and move forward. She couldn't afford to dwell on the past, not when she had responsibilities to meet. As she got ready for the day, she tried to shake off the weight of the previous encounter. The uniform she slipped into was a reminder of her purpose. It represented the years of hard work, the sacrifices, and the countless hours she had dedicated to her job. But as much as she wanted to focus on the tasks ahead, she knew that the incident with the officers had left its mark. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the badge on her chest. For a brief moment, she looked at herself, her reflection staring back at her. She thought about how no matter how many years she had been in law enforcement, she still had to fight against the prejudices that followed her. She had earned her place as a sheriff, but that didn't mean she was immune to the assumptions that others made based on her skin color or the way she carried herself. Karen took a deep breath and reminded herself of why she had chosen this profession in the first place. She had always wanted to make a difference in her community, to stand up for what was right even when it wasn't easy. She had seen firsthand the challenges that people from all walks of life faced, and she wanted to be someone who could help them navigate through those difficult times. The drive to the station was quiet, and Karen took the time to gather her thoughts. The streets were empty, the only sounds coming from the hum of the engine and the occasional bird calling out. As she approached the station, she could see her colleagues already starting their day. Some were heading inside, while others were unloading their patrol cars. It was just another day at the office for most of them, but for Karen, it felt like another chance to prove herself, yet again. When she stepped through the doors of the station, she was greeted with the usual nods and smiles from the officers. Most of them knew her, respected her, but Karen couldn't help but notice the glances that were exchanged when she entered the room. Some were subtle, others not so much. She had learned to read the unspoken cues, the little gestures that told her more than words ever could. As she made her way to her desk, her thoughts drifted back to the previous day. She couldn't shake the image of the rookie officer, standing there stunned when he realized who she was. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the moment. It was the fact that deep down she knew that his surprise wasn't just about the fact that she was the sheriff. It was the underlying discomfort that people often felt when faced with someone who didn't fit the mold they expected. Karen had been in law enforcement long enough to know that biases ran deep. They were ingrained in people, whether they were aware of it or not. It wasn't just about race, it was about power, authority, and the way people viewed the world. She had spent her career fighting against those biases, but it was an uphill battle. Every day she faced the challenge of proving herself in a world that wasn't always welcoming, no matter how many badges she wore or how many cases she solved. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her office door. She looked up to see one of her senior officers, a middle-aged man with years of experience, standing in the doorway. "Morning, Karen," he said with a smile. "Got a minute?" "Sure," she replied, motioning for him to come in. The officer stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I heard about what happened yesterday. You okay?" Karen sat back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "I'm fine," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral. "It was just another one of those situations." He nodded, his face serious. "I know it's not easy, but you handled it well. Not everyone would have kept their cool like you did." Karen appreciated the compliment, but it didn't erase the frustration she felt. "It's just tiring, you know," she said quietly. "I feel like I'm always in a position where I have to prove myself even when I shouldn't have to." The officer paused, thinking for a moment. "I get it. But you've earned the respect of your team, and that's what matters. Don't let one incident overshadow all the good you've done." Karen nodded but didn't reply. She appreciated his words, but the reality was that the world didn't always see her the way her colleagues did. The world didn't always see her as the accomplished professional she had worked so hard to become. And that was something she had to live with every single day. Before she could say anything else, her phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting the moment. Karen glanced at the screen and saw that it was a call from the dispatcher. She picked up the phone quickly, grateful for the distraction. "Karen?" The dispatcher's voice came through the line. "We've got a situation down by Maple Street. There's a disturbance. We need someone to respond." "On my way," Karen replied, hanging up the phone before the officer in her office could say anything else. She stood up, grabbing her jacket and badge as she headed toward the door. As she walked out of the station and into her patrol car, she tried to push the thoughts of the previous day aside. She couldn't afford to dwell on them, not when there was work to be done. The community needed her. She was the sheriff, and her job was to keep the peace no matter the challenges she faced. The drive to Maple Street was brief, but Karen's mind was still racing. She couldn't help but think about the larger picture, the world she navigated every day. The biases she faced weren't just about her position as sheriff. They were about her identity, the way people saw her before they saw who she truly was. It was something she couldn't change, but it was something she had learned to deal with over the years. When she arrived at the scene, she quickly assessed the situation. A group of people had gathered outside a house, and there was shouting coming from inside. It wasn't a violent situation, but it was tense. Karen stepped out of the car, scanning the crowd and looking for the person in charge. As she approached the group, they fell silent. Some of the people looked at her with a sense of respect, while others seemed unsure of her presence. She could feel the weight of their judgment, but she didn't let it affect her. She had a job to do. "Let's take this inside," she said calmly, motioning toward the house. The group reluctantly parted, allowing her to approach the door. As she knocked, she could hear the arguing continuing inside. But Karen didn't hesitate. She had dealt with these situations many times before. When the door opened, she was greeted by a man who immediately started to explain the situation. His words were a blur, but Karen's focus was on the facts. She knew that she had to keep a level head, even when the tension was high. Over the next few minutes, Karen managed to defuse the situation with calm authority. She spoke to the people involved, listening to their concerns and offering solutions where she could. By the time the situation was resolved, the crowd had dispersed and the tension had lifted. As Karen returned to her patrol car, she felt a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about solving the problem at hand. It was about showing the community that they could trust her, no matter what they thought of her before she arrived. The world might have its biases, but Karen knew that the best way to fight them was through actions, not words. She climbed into her car and drove back to the station, knowing that there would be more challenges ahead. But she also knew that she was ready to face them. The weight of yesterday's encounter still lingered, but it wouldn't stop her. She was determined to keep moving forward no matter what. The next few days passed in a blur. Karen threw herself into her work as she always did, trying to push the events of the previous week to the back of her mind. But despite her best efforts, the encounter with the officers and the underlying tension that came with it refused to fade away completely. It wasn't just the awkwardness of that moment. It was the feeling that no matter how hard she worked, she would always have to prove herself. The thought lingered, and it weighed heavily on her. But she was determined to not let it define her. As a sheriff, she knew that she had a responsibility to the people in her community, a responsibility that went beyond her own feelings and frustrations. She had made a promise to herself when she took on this role, and that promise wasn't just to serve, it was to be a role model, to show others that anyone could succeed if they worked hard enough and stayed true to themselves. She was sitting in her office, reviewing some paperwork when the phone rang. It was a call that would change the course of her day. Karen, the voice on the other end of the line, said, "We need you at the station. There's been an incident at the local high school." "It's pretty serious." Karen sat up straight, her mind instantly shifting into work mode. She had dealt with all sorts of situations in the past, but a serious incident at a school always carried extra weight. Kids were involved. There was always an added sense of urgency when it came to protecting young lives. She quickly grabbed her jacket and badge, already heading out the door before she even finished the call. As she drove to the school, her mind raced with the possibilities of what could have happened. Was it a fight? A potential threat? She had no way of knowing, but whatever it was, she knew that it was her responsibility to handle it with the utmost care. When she arrived at the school, the scene was chaotic. There were students gathered outside the main entrance, some crying, others looking confused. Teachers were trying to keep the students calm, and a couple of uniformed officers were speaking to the school principal near the entrance. The air was thick with tension, and Karen could feel her heartbeat quicken as she approached the group. "Karen," the principal called out, spotting her among the crowd. "Thank you for coming. We've had a serious altercation in the cafeteria. We need to figure out what's going on." Karen nodded, her expression serious. "Tell me what happened." The principal motioned toward the school doors. A fight broke out between two students. But it wasn't just a fight. There's talk that it might have been planned, maybe even organized. We're not sure, but we need to get to the bottom of it. Karen's mind began to process the information. A planned altercation? That didn't sound good. She followed the principal inside, where the chaos seemed even more intense. The cafeteria was filled with students who had either been part of the incident or had witnessed it. A few students sat with school counselors, their faces pale and shaken from whatever they had seen. Karen could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She approached one of the students, a young girl who appeared to be in shock. "Hey, I need you to stay calm," Karen said gently, her voice soothing but firm. "Can you tell me what happened?" The girl looked up, her eyes wide with fear. It happened so fast," she said, her voice trembling. "There were two boys and they just started fighting. I didn't see it coming." Karen nodded, offering the girl a comforting smile. "I know it's scary, but you're doing great. Just tell me what you saw and we'll take it from there." The girl hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "It wasn't just a normal fight," she said, glancing around nervously. "I think it was something planned. They seemed to know what they were doing, like they were trying to make a point." A feeling of unease crept up Karen's spine. A planned fight? That could mean something bigger was going on. She thanked the girl and moved toward the next group of students. She needed more information, and she needed it fast. The school had already contacted the local police department, and a few more officers had arrived to assist in gathering statements from the students. Karen joined them, quickly taking charge of the situation. She spoke to a few more students, piecing together the details of the altercation. It seemed like the two boys had a long-standing disagreement, but no one could confirm whether the fight had been planned or if it had escalated on its own. After speaking to several more students, Karen was certain of one thing: this wasn't just a random fight. There was something more behind it. But she wasn't ready to jump to conclusions just yet. She needed to gather all the facts before making any decisions. The principal stood beside her, clearly anxious. "What do you think, Karen?" Karen paused for a moment, thinking. "I think we need to take this one step at a time. We don't know yet if this was just a personal dispute or if something more serious is going on. We'll need to review the footage from the security cameras and interview the students more thoroughly. But for now, let's keep the students calm and make sure the situation doesn't escalate further." The principal nodded, clearly relieved by Karen's calm and confident approach. "Thank you. I knew you'd know what to do." Karen gave a small nod, her mind already working through the next steps. There was a lot to figure out, and the situation needed to be handled with care. As she turned to leave the cafeteria, she couldn't help but think back to the events of the previous days. The encounter with the officers, the feelings of being judged, of having to prove herself over and over again. But in this moment, standing in the middle of the school, she realized something important. Her job wasn't just about enforcing the law or handling difficult situations. It was about showing up when people needed her, no matter what they thought of her beforehand. She was more than just the sheriff. She was a leader, someone who was capable of making a difference in people's lives even when the odds seemed stacked against her. The days that followed were filled with investigation and interviews. As Karen pieced together the details of the fight, she uncovered a more complex issue than she had originally thought. The altercation had been planned, but it wasn't just about the two boys. There were deeper tensions at play, tensions that went beyond just the school. It was clear that the fight had been a symptom of something bigger, something that would take more time to unravel. But Karen didn't shy away from the challenge. She handled the investigation with the same professionalism and dedication that she brought to every aspect of her job. In the end, she was able to resolve the situation, bringing the students involved into the principal's office and working with the school to create a solution that would prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. As the days went on, Karen's frustration from the previous week began to fade. She realized that no matter how many times she was judged or overlooked, her work would speak for itself. She wasn't defined by other people's assumptions. She was defined by the impact she had on her community, the way she showed up when people needed her most, and that was enough.